Could you please introduce our next speaker?
With pleasure. So again, Alexander, I'm very sorry I took some time from you, but I can already see you're online. I don't see, you're not, your video is not on and your sound is not on yet, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. Oh, hi, you're on. Hello, Alexander.
Hi. Hello, hi.
So very glad to have an honor of introducing you. So Dr. Alexander Deicke is also in Germany, same as me, and speaking to us from Germany. He's a lawyer here in Germany and has years and years of experience in data privacy. And what I also find super interesting about his profile is that he is an advisor in European Association of Data Protection Professionals, which is fantastic. We haven't had that until what is it, a year and a half ago. We are, you know, in Europe, we have the most probably advanced and the most progressive legislation in data privacy, and we still didn't have our own association until, what is it, 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, when it was founded, the European Association. So Alexander is going to, so we're going to dive deeper into, you know, the expert level of our talks is going to be deeper and deeper right now, because Alexander is going to talk about something very specific, and which is data deletion concepts, something that is for some reason is not talked too much about, and I'm super excited to hear you speak about that. It's something that there are a lot of question marks, I mean, at least in my head, and there are also a lot of fines about around this whole context of not deleting the data. Before you start, Alexander, I want to ask you, do you prefer to have questions in the end, or should I also ask them while they appear? How do you prefer to do it?
No, as you like. I'm really open for answering the question directly, but also at the end. So if someone have a question to a certain topic in the presentation, it would, I would say it makes sense to ask it directly.
Okay, all right. I'm going to switch off my video now, and then if I switch it on, it means there is a question.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, the floor is yours.
So then I need to, first of all, I need to share my screen.
You have the screen sharing, right? Yeah, fantastic.
I have the screen sharing opportunity, and now do you see the presentation already?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, we can see it. We can see it. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm not seeing it on the screen now. That's a little bit irritating, but
we can see the whole PowerPoint, not just one slide, but we can see the entire. It's
better now.
Presenter view yet. It's still not in the presenter view. I mean, it's fine. We can see and read what's on the screen, but just so you know, it's not in the presenter view, so we can see the slides that are coming next as well.
Okay, no problem. I have it now as on the presenter screen for myself. So and let me try to change this. I'm a little bit quicker than you've planned my session. So
that's fine. I just had
be a problem.
I just had these problems too, so can relate.
Because do you see the screen now?
No, you stopped sharing.
Okay, that's not working. Allow them. So now you should see.
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it. Yeah.
Full screen or not?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it works. It's still, we can see.
No, then it's fine. Then I'm working like it is.
Yeah. Let's do it the way it is.
And I try to go through the presentation in this way. That's kind of tricky.
I think the reason is that you share the particular window, and probably you chose the window of editing.
Yeah, but I have the window in a way that I can share it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, it looks fine. So.
Yeah, it works.
And you see when okay, it works.
Yeah, it's switching.
Okay, sorry everyone to have a complicated start, but let's start with the first slide is probably about what I'm doing. I want to highlight 2 points what I'm actually doing. One thing is the CertNext GmbH, because in Germany we are close to have our first program regarding data privacy certifications. And hopefully we are able to certificate companies at the end of this year. So I wanted to highlight this certification company and also highlight my role as the group DPO, because as we learned now, it is really interesting to have both sides, internal and external people on DPO roles. And what I've learned in the last couple of years is that there are regulatory roles and there needs to be someone that is doing the work. For example, if you want to implement a DPO function and a data privacy management system in a big organization like Male with 80,000 people, then you need to be aware that data privacy setup in all these countries is different. Means also what we're talking today about is the deletion concept will be different. Perhaps there are retention periods by law in some countries that are different to them in another country. And therefore you need at least some touch points in these countries, taking care of the local legislation, taking care also of this kind of retention periods that your scheme will be legally binding also in these countries. What we've done by in the structure of Male is to have an external DPO, that's me, and then we have data privacy department. It's around 5 people that are working in the headquarters, and then we have representatives in all countries, and in some countries also more than one. If we have several sites in a country, could be that we have also a country lead. Why I'm really curious about explaining how our view of data privacy management systems work is because of when we're now talking about deletion schemes, deletion concepts, purging concepts, or however you call it, then we need to be aware that these are 2 aspects. One aspect is you can't implement a deletion scheme in a company if you have not implemented a management system. Because what is the deletion scheme for? It is for helping you, as you see here, the agenda when we talk about what is this concept, why do companies need deletion scheme or deletion concept, and how can you accomplish to get one, and a kind of a conclusion, and I will end with this conclusion. Here you have, I have a summary, and I'm not sure if probably we can share afterwards the presentation, but the most important thing about this slide is to learn and to understand. Back in the days when data privacy started, it was clear that all the hard drives, the hard copies, even copies with personal data is in fact governed by older legislation, and it's also governed by the GDPR, and therefore you always need to keep in mind, if you're talking about deletion concept, there are always 2 aspects. One is the digital deletion of the concept, and the other one is the concept about hard copies, files, documents. Even documents is an important aspect for having the whole deletion concept manageable. Because if you're, for example, in Germany, we're talking afterwards about the deletion of an invoice. There is legislation in Germany of a tax legislation that is binding companies to store invoices for 10 years. Now you can argue for sure they do not need to be stored in a hard copy way. They can also be stored in a revision in a revision a safe way, in a digital way. That's true. But in the end, you have to store it. Therefore, it's always a combination. If we are now talking about the deletion periods, we're also talking about the retention periods and how long companies need to store their personal data. And it is often said that in the GDPR setup, it's more a general term that data should not be stored in an extensive way. That's true. But it's also an aspect of subjects. If there is an eraser request from subject, you need to have process in place beforehand. I had clients, big corporates, that started with their data privacy management systems when they had their first subject request, erasure requests, and they were surprised because then they realized, hey, this person is in the hidden data of documents. It is in presentations, it is in emails, it is in invoices. We have them on our home pages. There's so many places in a company where you store personal data, depending on the person, if it's a client or if it's an employee, or even if it's an organ. Some people believe that organs, managing directors, or CEOs are not covered by the GDPR, but that's not true. If you really, for example, have a dispute with a former managing director, the easiest way to make the company some kind of trouble is asking them to delete everything where the personal data of this private individual is stored inside a company, because it means mostly everything if it has been on board for a while. And this is, in my point, the most important thing about this slide, to acknowledge that it's not only a digital deletion concept. I had once a client, a big energy producer in the south of Germany, and I was not working as a DPO. I had the pleasure to be responsible for the real estate department. And I was at a big site, and I asked, what is all this paper for? And they told me, these are the employee files for the last 100 years. They were so proud in storing all the personal data from all their employees since the company was founded. And I was shocked. I was also shocked because of my function in these days, because I said it costs a lot of money. You have to take care of. It's dangerous because it's paper. I also was a little bit surprised because of my data privacy knowledge. I was then had an appointment with the DPO and asking him, how can you accept that they store all the files from all employees? He was trying to get around the topic and told me something about some historical approach that we store these files, but it's not allowed. The only answer is it's not allowed, and if someone is really analyzing and auditing the company, then they will for sure penalize this kind of behavior, because you are, from a GDPR standpoint, you only are allowed to store data as long as it is needed, and no longer. The only thing is, if there is a retention period by law, you need to store it longer, but only for this special purpose. This is a really important aspect of producing kind of a deletion scheme, because in the end, you need to be aware that the data you store because of a legal retention period means that it is only allowed to use this data in this way. I had once a consultation with an authority, and we have the pleasure in Germany to have 60. And they had an inquiry because of a subject, because the subject was calling the company and was asking something, and the company was giving them an answer in at the first level support. And then he was going back to the authority, telling them they could answer me on the first level support, but 1 or 2 months earlier, I've asked them to delete all my data. And the company, before they before they engaged me, or my company, they said the argumentation with the authority was we need to store it from the legal retention periods for X years, and therefore it was in our systems. But the authority in Hamburg still said to them, we don't care. If you need to store it on a legal base, that's fine. But you can't use it for CRM, customer relationship management. You can't use it for your service level support. You are not allowed to. You are only allowed to use it. This was tax data in a way that tax authorities and other authorities have access to this data if it's needed. That's all. So this is for probably the slides when it comes to the concept itself. And here again, I'm talking about the subject rights, the right to erasure, and what it means. I had once a client where a former employee was using his right to erasure to making some trouble because they had produced with the employee a marketing campaign. And I don't know why, but they were separating and they were terminating the employment contract. And then the issue occurred that the employee was using his right to erasure and they had no agreement in place, no license agreement. So in my point of view, a good deletion concept also covers aspects like the usage of data that needs to be used even if a subject is using his right for erasure. So you need a license agreement, for example, for pictures or voice or whatsoever used from your employees if you're using these kind of personal data for marketing campaigns. It's a really important issue because it's getting more and more into employment courts, and there you only have the chance to pay the former employee out of these license obligations. So when we are looking into the fines, and I've learned today you also had a session about penalties, fines, and also a kind of a structure. And I've seen a chart here where the fines are located and what's the amount of fine. I have here an example with the Deutsche Wohnen. I know it was now reduced, but in the end, we have in Germany the big fines with Deutsche Wohnen at the beginning, or United Internet, was about deletion, missing deletion schemes, and was about the missing authorization schemes. And therefore, I think it's really important to realize it's a complicated issue, because when you start thinking about deletion schemes, you realize, how is it even possible to delete data in a ERP system like SAP or Salesforce, in the big systems of big companies? And they learned it is possible. At the beginning, when the GDPR was announced, big companies, the big two players like Salesforce and SAP, they both said, we are not willing to accept this. We are not implementing structures. But then they changed really quickly their mind. SAP were announcing that lifecycle management will be free for all companies that are using the tool to delete data inside of their system. And also Microsoft now have changed their structures. Personal data is no longer inside of files, and you have a certain methodology to opt out of storing data inside of documents and files of the hidden information. So I think nowadays you are really able to you are able to produce a deletion scheme also in a way that you're able to have it in your whole organization. That means for your emails, for your service, for all the tools that you're using. For example, if you are working together with a big tool provider of OneTrust, or I don't want to make commercials for any of them, but ArcTrust or Otres in Germany, or what's the name of all these providers, but they all provide you with a certain tool now for deletion and purging, and also for authorization and access control. And therefore, it is possible, but in the end, the bigger the organization, in my point of view, the more time you need to invest for a deletion project. Here I've tried to summarize a little bit what we do if we produce a deletion scheme from the scratch. We are normally start defining deletion classes, and there it is really important that you see that there is data and documents. These can be the same, but do not need to be with the same, and do not need to have the same retention periods. For example, an invoice can have different retention periods than the content on the invoice itself. We had a discussion with one authority outside of Germany where we had the issue that the only personal data on the invoice was the name of the owner of the company. And we argued that the owner of the company, because it was in the name of the company, and then it was also under the name of the company, it was the name of the owner of the company. And we argued that he don't want to be seen as aspect of personal data in this document. We were not successful with our argumentation, but we tried. They said it's still personal data, even if the subject is not willing to see his personal data in this respect as personal data under GDPR. We had the same discussions with one authority in Germany, so it's pretty clear at this point for our clients that also the name of the managing director and the name of the owner of a company is seen as personal data. So we defined different deletion classes. We categorize personal data. For example, if it's really sensible data, we try to gather all categories into groups where we can have an automated way to delete, depending on the retention period of these kind of data. We often have tax-oriented retention periods, and therefore we try to gather all information and documents from the financial departments where personal data is involved. We separate it to all the personal data from the employees, from the HR department, because there it's different. You have, in Germany, for example, you have a retention period to store data of applicants for a certain period, or I think it's 3 months. Afterwards, you are allowed to ask the subject to store it longer for upcoming application process, but you're not allowed to store it for all time. So therefore, you need to have you have a legally binding retention period of 3 months. Then you have, for example, the consent to store the CV for another 6 months. Means you have an internal retention period of 9 months. And therefore, we are looking into the companies. Is there more classes where you have 9 months? Probably not. Most periods are oriented to a couple of years, depending on how long are you able to fulfill claims under certain legislations.
Alexander, there is a question, if I may interrupt you shortly, because I think it nicely goes with what you just mentioned. What should a DPO, or what do you do if a CEO or recruitment director are strictly against deletion of old data from the systems?
They're most of the time against the deletion concepts. When I'm starting working with companies, I'm trying to explain them, look into your history. How often was it the case that data was used against the company? If you're looking into the big compliance issues happened in the last 10 years, Deicke or Panama Papers, there were often data found that was used against the company, but it's so rarely used for the company. But you're absolutely right. I always try to convince managing directors. It's always an obstacle because they believe, most people believe, I store everything. Because if someone comes to me telling me I've done something wrong, I'm pulling out the email 10 years ago. Hey, no, I've told you exactly what I do. Here is the email. But this never happens. In my experience, they all pretend they need these kind of data for excuse, for liability reasons, or warranty reasons, or whatsoever. But in fact, they don't need it. And it's really a hard communication to convince them that it's binding by law, that it's needed. And storage is expensive. All companies are changing now to software as a service. I'm also, for my company, have changed to Office 365, and so licensing is expensive, storage is expensive. So this is how I get them. Most of the time, I'm trying to speak to the CFOs, trying to get them with the cost. It was the same with the big retail company where I'm trying to tell them, hey, you have such a huge space for all these personal data files from the HR department. You can delete them and you can erase them. You can get rid of all these paper, and then you have more storage. And this is probably how I try to handle the situation.
Fantastic, thank you.
So this is probably about the communication, because in the end you need to establish, next to the categorization, then to, as I said, the separation between data and documents, and then also to evaluate an purging mechanism. It's not clear. Most people believe, yeah, then I'm delete. But deletion is not just a way to say I'm deleting on my computer, then it's erased. There are deletion mechanism, erasure mechanisms that are able to delete it in a way that no one else can reproduce it. We often had these discussions with anonymization and pseudonymization. The only way something is really anonymous is when no one else can, with a certain amount of time, recreate the information. And that's the same with deletion. So therefore, you need to be aware that there needs to be a mechanism that is where you are able to delete. There's another question.
Yeah, we keep getting more and more questions now. The next one was about the deletion requests. If you can still hold details like unique customer number, will all associated personal details like name, email, etc. deleted? It's probably not the question that can be answered shortly because it's so context dependent. But yeah, essentially, if you can still hold some details if there is a deletion request.
We had these discussions when we have these projects. So we had these discussions about log files, because the tricky thing is you can delete everything, but if you store the log files where you transmit it, and no matter how you transmit the personal data, because the subject requests are often in a way that someone is asking for subject request in the first instance, and then the last paragraph is, after you give me all the information, please delete everything you have. So therefore, you have the transmission log file, and there you can restore, rebuild all this information. I tend to really delete, because the good thing about deletion is if you delete really everything, and the subject is then asking again something, it's no longer a subject for your company. The best thing that can happen for your organization, if someone having a subject request, and you are really deleting everything, then it's done. And no one else can blame you that you have fulfilled the request of the subject. You have to store all data that is needed with a retention period by law, but everything else, I would delete it, just delete it. If you, for example, if you need an email address or an address for, there is something in the commercial area like the Robinson list. Robinson list is something in Germany where someone can enter his email, and if the email is on the list, you're not allowed to to send commercial to these people. So therefore, there is a reason why you need to store the email. You always have to think in different brackets. The general approach is to delete everything, and then there could be reasons why you store the data. If you, for example, have to block addresses for your catalogs, because it's a provision by law that these people are allowed to stop your catalogs, your commercial deliveries, then you need to store the address. But you don't need to store the address with the name. So it can be an anonymous way. So therefore, the address is blocked. I know, I often hear from the marketing department, yeah, but if he's no longer living there, we can use the address. I would not tend to go this risk. I would just block the address. So to be really concrete, I would delete everything as possible.
Great advice. I can relate to that. There is another question that I find fantastic that I also actually wanted to ask you at some point. From what to start with deletion of data? Where do you start? And my perspective is that my background here is that if you're dealing with a company that has too many information systems, too many categories of data, too many purposes for those data, completely endless amount of categories of data subjects, where do you start of deleting with deletion?
Yeah, the easiest way to start is with the ERP system, because with SAP, with a big company, with SAP or Salesforce, you always have the appropriate tool. For example, if you are looking into SAP and realized how they changed a little bit their tools, like they're changing from server-oriented tools into software as a subject with their HANA cloud, and most of the time, I would always start with the heart of a company, and that's the employees. Means you always have personal data with the employees, and therefore start with the HR module of Salesforce or SAP. They both have a tool to delete. For both companies, it's free. And therefore, I would start from this approach, because there you have to start. If you develop, for example, a new project and changing to the HANA cloud, for example, then you need to use a deletion scheme. If you're implementing a software tool from the big players, one aspect for the processing register is the deletion. Therefore, you have also to enter something, and therefore I would start from the HR block. Or I would start, for example, if you start to implement a new tool provider, a big one, and then I would start with the processing register, and from there into other departments. Because otherwise it's too big. And don't start with the emails. A big advice is people love their emails. They love their archives. Do it step by step. Block their hard drive, block their USB ports, and then from time to time start working with them that they're using their cloud. Because cloud is I remember, I think 10 years, 15 years ago, all the people said, business, cloud providers, the devil in it's so complicated and it's so bad. But nowadays, I think it's just gorgeous development, because there you can really work so easily with deletion schemes, because you have, as you said, see here, established automated blocking and also automated deletion. If you are developing a deletion mechanism, it's so easy with a cloud system. If you don't use the data, if you haven't used it for a year, delete it. And I'm pretty sure if you're playing with all these possibilities, you find your own way. And what I've learned is with authorities in the last couple of years, if you have something in place, they are fine. With Deutsche Wohnen, for example, in Germany, our big penalty, the case was the Berlin authority was there telling them you need to delete the data of your customers. If they are no longer your customers, you need to delete it.
Yeah.
And then they said to the authority, no, that's too expensive. If you change the software, we asked him, it's 3 to 5 million to change the software that it's possible in the software to delete. And therefore we will not do it, because this was the days of the BDSG. and it was 50K or 250K
Yeah.
for a penalty. No one was caring, and so and this was a little bit the tricky situation with the Deutsche Wohnen. They have just said they will not do it, but if you're starting at some point, I think it's fine. So I'm quite in time, so I would say this is probably the last slide I have, and afterwards I'm more than fine to share the slides if you want to dig a little bit deeper into the subject, because I think a few of the questions are going to the point when to start with the deletion scheme. And I would say data always have a kind of life cycle. And from my point of view, privacy by default and privacy by design means if you start thinking about generate personal data, for example, for a fair, for a student fair to acquire new employees, this is the point in the HR department where you are developing a campaign, a strategy. And at this point, you should think about the whole process. At this point, I always try companies to communicate, convince them to involve the data privacy department, officer, external, internal, no matter at this stage, because then you can talk about the whole data lifecycle from the generation of the personal data as a fair until the deletion of the data, because it always ends with the absolute anonymization or deletion of the data. So yeah, I would say I thank you really much for your attention. If you have any more questions, don't hesitate to contact me or one of my colleagues. Until now, I would say we have produced deletion schemes for companies with 100,000 employees, but also for 20 employees. And the most important aspect is just to start to do something, and then everything will evolve to some extent. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, so much for the presentation and for the answers, for bringing a bit of light into this topic that is not talked about enough, I find, but is crucially important, especially as we see in the law enforcement practice context.